The countryside had always been a place of quiet resilience. Rolling hills brushed with morning mist, red barns faded by sun and time, and long fences stretching across the land like the wrinkles of age and endurance. For decades, those fences had been symbols of respect, dividing property, yes, but also preserving peace. And for one man, that peace was everything. Eli Turner was a man carved from the land itself. His hands were scarred by decades of labor, his skin darkened by sun and soil. His family had worked this same farm for 3 generations. To him, the creak of his old wooden gate was the sound of home. He took pride in simplicity, fresh paint on the barn, mended wire on the fence, the scent of cut hay drifting over his fields. But that peace, quiet, steady, unshakable, was about to meet its greatest enemy, vanity. Next door stood a house that did not belong in the countryside. It gleamed like a suburban transplant, all glass and beige perfection, surrounded by trimmed hedges that looked as though they were afraid to grow freely. Its owner, a woman named Patricia Holloway, though the locals whispered Karen under their breath, had moved in just months earlier. She was known for her perfectly styled hair, her relentless complaints, and her obsession with appearances. To Patricia, everything had to look right, even if it meant stepping on others' peace to get there. At first, it was small things. She left notes about Eli's tractor being too noisy. She called the county when she saw his cattle near the fence line, worried they might wander too close. But the breaking point came one golden morning when she stood at her property's edge, coffee mug in hand, staring at Eli's fence as though it had personally offended her. Eli's fence was practical, a mix of old cedar planks and steel wire, built sturdy but weathered. To Patricia, it was an eyesore. She wanted a view of the fields, something rustic yet elegant, as she later described to the HOA she had helped form. That was the day the first letter arrived. It was crisp, printed, and dripping with entitlement. It demanded Eli replace or beautify his fence to fit the neighborhood standard. It even cited a non-existent visual uniformity clause. Eli had chuckled when he read it. Then he set it aside, thinking it would blow over like the spring wind. But Patricia didn't stop there. She started taking pictures of his fence, his tractors, even his tool shed, and forwarding them to anyone who would listen. She hosted HOA meetings on her porch, inviting other residents from the area, most of whom had lived peacefully there long before she arrived. Some came out of curiosity, others out of fear of her complaints. Within weeks, the peaceful dirt road had turned tense. Rumors grew like weeds. Some said Eli's fence lowered property values. Others whispered that Patricia was planning to file a formal complaint. For the first time in years, Eli felt the air of his farm grow heavy with unease. But he didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He simply observed. He knew men like himself were often underestimated, written off as stubborn relics of the past. Patricia saw him as a farmer, nothing more. She didn't see the former Army engineer who had once designed field fortifications under harsher conditions than any HOA rulebook. She didn't see the man who read every clause of county law before driving a single post into the earth. Weeks passed. Patricia grew louder. She sent more letters. Eli stayed silent. That silence began to unnerve her. She expected outrage, or at least a confrontation, but all she got was a nod when their eyes met at the fence line. It wasn't surrender, it was something else. Then one afternoon, a rumble echoed across the valley. It wasn't thunder. It was machinery, Eli's backhoe crawling toward the edge of his land. Patricia watched from her window, curiosity turning to indignation as he began digging, measuring, and setting markers. She assumed he was finally replacing the fence she had complained about. Finally beautifying it. But Eli Turner was not building a fence. He was drawing battle lines. By evening, steel posts stood upright like soldiers. Thick beams followed, anchored deep in concrete. Patricia could see it rising, section by section, higher, thicker, far too imposing for a simple fence. Her frustration boiled into rage. She marched out, yelling across the property line, but Eli didn't respond. He just kept working, methodically, quietly, with the precision of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Over the next few days, the structure grew tall enough to cast shadows over her pristine backyard, long enough to stretch the full boundary between them. Reinforced gates, stone foundations, and treated timber that looked more like fortress walls than a country fence. It was legal, of course. Every inch of it. Eli had done his homework, ensuring that every measurement, every material, every setback complied with county code. There was nothing she or her HOA could do. When the final panel went up, the sun dipped behind it, plunging Patricia's manicured garden into shade. Her perfect view of the countryside was gone, replaced by an immovable wall of rural defiance. The local rumor mill exploded. Photos of Eli's fortress-like fence began circulating online. People from nearby towns drove by just to see it. Some called it the Great Wall of Turner. Others called it poetic justice. But for Eli, it wasn't about revenge, at least not yet. For him, it was about reclaiming peace. About sending a message without saying a word. As night fell and the last streak of light faded behind the towering wall, Eli sat on his porch with a quiet cup of coffee. Beyond that wall, Patricia fumed in silence, her ego bruised, her plans dismantled. But deep down, she wasn't done. And neither, it seemed, was he. Because in small towns, grudges don't fade, they ferment. And this one was just beginning to boil, word of Eli Turner's towering fence spread faster than wildfire through the quiet countryside. What had once been a whisper on porches became the talk of every feed store and diner in the county. Some admired the sheer audacity of it, a middle finger made of timber and steel. Others shook their heads, fearing it would bring trouble. And trouble, as always, was already coming. Patricia Holloway couldn't sleep. Every time she looked out her back window, the wall loomed over her like a taunt. The morning sunlight no longer reached her patio. Her carefully trimmed rose garden now sat in permanent shadow, wilting under the weight of humiliation. She had moved to the country for peace, prestige, and power. Now she had none. To Patricia, this was war. And wars, in her mind, were not fought with dirt and sweat, they were fought with paperwork. Within days, she began her campaign. Letters flew to the county office, to the zoning board, even to the state agriculture department. Each one was meticulously typed, filled with phrases like visual obstruction, community standards, and public nuisance. But every response she received came back the same: Eli Turner's structure was fully compliant. Legal in every way. That realization only fueled her fury. So she turned to the only army she thought she could control, the newly formed Homeowners Association. Though most residents saw the HOA as unnecessary meddling, Patricia ruled it with the precision of a self-appointed queen. Her meetings became strategy sessions, complete with printed agendas and binders labeled "the fence issue." She recruited allies, appealing to their vanity and fear. She whispered that Eli's fortress would drag down property values, that soon others might follow his example of defiance. For some, that fear worked. Signatures began to appear on petitions. Not many, but enough for her to feel power return to her grasp. The HOA issued its first notice of community violation. It cited fabricated rules and false precedents. Eli received the noti. On a wind-blown morning, tucked under his truck's windshield wiper like a parking ticket. He read it once, folded it, and placed it neatly inside his pocket. Not a word was said. That silence infuriated Patricia more than any insult could have. She wanted him rattled. She wanted to see his pride crack. But instead, he simply carried on. Weeks passed, and the air between their properties thickened like summer humidity before a storm. HOA board members began driving by the Turner property, cameras in hand, snapping photos as though collecting evidence for a crime. They circled his land like vultures, each hoping to find a legal flaw in his construction. But Eli was unshakable. Every nail, every beam, every yard of concrete had been placed with surgical precision. He had spent weeks reading county ordinances, memorizing setback limits, height restrictions, and land use codes. His fence wasn't just strong, it was bulletproof by law. Still, Patricia persisted. She began calling local reporters, painting herself as a victim of rural aggression. A massive, unsightly barrier, she told them, blocking natural light and community harmony. Her words found their way into a small-town paper, and soon after, into local television. A camera crew showed up one morning, parking near Eli's driveway. They filmed the wall, the farm, even caught a distant glimpse of Eli himself walking through his field with calm indifference. To the viewers, the story was clear: a stubborn farmer and a pushy neighbor locked in a feud over pride. But what the cameras didn't show was the undercurrent of something deeper, the quiet, meticulous revenge still building behind those walls. Because while Patricia was crafting press releases and complaints, Eli was crafting something far more permanent. Each evening, when the light dimmed and the reporters left, he continued his work behind the fence. Patricia could hear the faint clatter of tools, the hum of machinery, the occasional flash of welding light piercing through cracks. Whatever he was doing, it wasn't just maintenance. It was preparation. Soon, rumors began again. Some said Eli was fortifying his property with cameras, motion sensors, and reinforced gates. Others claimed he was building storage bunkers or underground workshops. No one knew for sure. But one thing was clear: the fortress was evolving. Then came the turning point. The HOA, emboldened by Patricia's persistence, decided to escalate. They announced a community inspection day, claiming authority to review all visible property violations. It was a thinly veiled excuse to step onto Eli's land. On the morning of the inspection, 3 HOA members arrived, clipboards in hand, fake smiles plastered across their faces. Patricia stood behind them, her sunglasses hiding a smirk. They knocked on Eli's gate, but no one answered. After a few minutes, they decided to proceed without permission. The gate creaked open just far enough for one of them to step through. But the moment his boot hit the dirt inside, a deep mechanical sound filled the air. Cameras turned, one by one, tracking movement. A warning siren, a low, measured tone echoed from a hidden speaker. Startled, they froze. Eli appeared then, silent as the dawn, standing beside his barn. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just looked at them, an unblinking stare that carried generations of resolve. The HOA members stammered apologies and backed away, retreating faster than they came. Patricia followed, her cheeks burning with humiliation. By afternoon, the story had spread through the entire town. Some said the fortress was wired with motion alarms. Others swore there were automated floodlights and reinforced locks that could stop a truck. But the truth was simpler and far more effective. Eli had built a system of deterrence, all within his rights, designed to make one message clear: stay off my land. That night, Patricia sat on her porch, her confidence crumbling. Every move she made, every attempted control, had been met with calm precision and quiet defiance. She could feel her reputation slipping, neighbors no longer rallied behind her. Some even began mocking her behind closed doors, calling her the queen of the fence. But the war wasn't over. Ego, after all, doesn't surrender, it regroups. And as autumn rolled in, Patricia's obsession reached its breaking point. She was no longer just trying to win. She was trying to destroy. The leaves had begun to turn gold when the fortress became more than a local legend. What started as gossip in the feed store and whispers at the diner soon spilled onto the internet, carried by curiosity and the thrill of small-town drama. It began with a single drone video. A teenager from the nearby town had flown his drone over Eli Turner's property to capture footage of what everyone was calling the Great Wall of Turner. The video showed the full scale of Eli's creation, a seamless blend of craftsmanship and defiance. It wasn't just a fence, it was a statement. Reinforced cedar panels towered above head height, anchored into thick concrete foundations. Steel bracing glimmered beneath the afternoon sun, and the symmetry of the structure was almost military in its precision. The footage was breathtaking, cinematic even. And once uploaded, it exploded. Within days, millions had watched it. The comments were filled with admiration, laughter, and outrage. Man built a castle just to block a Karen's view. This is art. Pure rural art. Justice served in cedar and concrete. News outlets picked it up. Influencers dissected the feud in dramatic retellings. Memes flooded social media, Patricia's perfectly staged suburban home shadowed by the wall of a man who refused to bend. Some even photoshopped battlements and flags on top of the fence, calling Eli the lord of the land. What had been Patricia's crusade for control had turned her into a national punchline. At first, she tried to fight the narrative. She issued statements calling the viral posts misrepresentations and harassment. She emailed journalists demanding they respect privacy and property values. But it was too late. Once the internet decided you were the villain, there was no rewriting the story. Meanwhile, Eli went about his life unchanged. He didn't court the attention, didn't respond to interviews, didn't post a single word online. His silence only deepened the myth. People projected their own ideals onto him, a humble man standing up to entitlement, a symbol of rural defiance against suburban arrogance. He had become what Patricia never expected, a hero. But fame, even accidental fame, changes things. Cars began lining up along the county road. Strangers stopped by to snap photos beside the fortress. Tourists posed near the gate, some leaving small trinkets, coins, hats, even a hand-painted sign that read "Respect Boundaries." Eli didn't like the attention, but he understood it. People weren't just drawn to the wall itself, they were drawn to the idea of it. The story had become a reflection of everyone's quiet wish to stand up against unfairness and walk away victorious. Still, the attention came at a cost. The constant stream of onlookers drove Patricia further into paranoia. She began to see every car as an intruder, every camera as mockery. She couldn't step outside without feeling watched, her once pristine privacy now consumed by the very spotlight she had lit. And in her frustration, she made her biggest mistake yet. She called for legal escalation. Through a friend in the county, she managed to push for a visual impact review, a rarely used process that allowed officials to assess whether a structure unreasonably disrupted the aesthetic harmony of the community. It was a long shot, but it was the only weapon left in her arsenal. When Eli received the notice, it was déjà vu. Another letter, another attempt to break him with paper instead of principle. But this time, he didn't fold it neatly away. This time, he acted. For the first time since the feud began, Eli reached out, not with words, but with strategy. He called in an old friend, a surveyor, and began a full legal audit of both properties. He gathered photographs, permits, measurements, even Patricia's past construction records. Every nail she'd driven without proper approval, every decorative addition that skirted code, he documented them all. While she tried to drag him into court, he was quietly building a case of his own. And then, just as county officials began their review, something unexpected happened. A popular YouTube channel covering real-life revenge stories released a feature-length video titled The Farmer vs. the HOA Queen. It was cinematic, complete with drone footage, narration, and dramatic music. The video retold everything from the first letter to the fortress wall. It painted Patricia as the antagonist and Eli as the embodiment of rural resilience. The story struck a nerve. Within 48 hours, the video reached 10 million views. It wasn't just viral, it was viral history. News trucks began appearing on the roadside again, this time not for Patricia's sound bites but to capture the man himself. Offers rolled in: interviews, brand deals, even reality show pitches. Eli turned them all down. Instead, he quietly issued one statement through a local newspaper. It was a single paragraph: "My fence meets every law. My piece costs nothing. Both are staying right where they are." That line echoed across the internet like a verdict. Patricia's legal complaint collapsed before it even began. The county inspectors, under immense public scrutiny, declared the fortress within all structural and visual compliance. The case was dismissed, and her HOA began to fracture. Board members resigned. Neighbors who once feared her now avoided her altogether. By winter, Patricia Holloway stood alone, her reputation reduced to online ridicule and local whispers. She had wanted the countryside to fit her vision. Instead, it had swallowed her whole. Eli's farm, meanwhile, became something of a pilgrimage site, a monument to stubbornness and justice. People came from out of state just to see it. Some left notes thanking him for standing up for the little guy. And though he never said it aloud, Eli found quiet satisfaction in knowing that the wall had done more than block her view, it had revealed her true self to the world. But as snow began to fall across the countryside, a new shift began to stir behind Patricia's closed curtains. Shame had turned to bitterness, and bitterness was beginning to rot into something darker. Because for some people, defeat isn't the end. It's the seed of destruction waiting to bloom. Winter wrapped the countryside in silence. Snow blanketed Eli Turner's land, muffling the world beneath its weight. The fence, his fortress, stood untouched, strong as ever, its shadow stretching pale across the frozen fields. It was a monument now, a symbol of defiance that had outlasted storms, scrutiny, and spite. But beneath that stillness, another kind of storm was brewing. Patricia Holloway's world had collapsed. Her pristine reputation, once upheld by gossip and intimidation, had crumbled under the weight of public humiliation. The very community she had sought to rule now treated her like a cautionary tale. Strangers pointed at her home. Neighbors whispered when she passed. Every time she stepped outside, she felt the eyes of judgment, invisible but unbearable. And worst of all, every time she looked out her window, she saw it, the wall. That immovable symbol of her defeat. At first, she avoided looking at it. Then she couldn't stop. Each morning, she stood at her kitchen sink, staring at the towering panels that cut her off from the open fields. It mocked her. Taunted her. Reminded her that she had lost. Her humiliation had become obsession. In the weeks following the viral explosion, Patricia isolated herself from the HOA, what remained of it, at least. The board had disbanded after the county ruling, and those once eager to follow her lead now refused to return her calls. Her house, once a hub of control, became a fortress of loneliness. And in that solitude, her anger began to take shape. She started keeping in notebook pages filled with thoughts, sketches, and plans. She studied county law again, scouring for loopholes, exceptions, any point of leverage she could twist. But where once she saw control, now she saw walls, legal, social, personal, all closing in on her. That's when the idea came to her. Not lawful. Not rational. But satisfying. If she couldn't tear down Eli's wall through rules, she'd make him pay another way. Late one night, Patricia walked her property line in silence. Her breath fogged in the cold air. The moon glowed dimly behind drifting clouds, casting faint light across the snow. She reached the fence and pressed her gloved hand against the timber. The cold bit through the leather. On the other side lay the man who had destroyed her pride. She whispered to herself, almost ritualistically, "You took everything." Then she began to plan. It started small. She filed anonymous noise complaints, claiming Eli's machinery ran at night. She called the county about hazardous structures, using burner emails. She even left fake reviews about his farmstand business, painting him as aggressive and unhinged. But Eli, as always, did not react. The noise complaints went nowhere. The reviews were ignored. Her efforts bounced off him like stones off steel. That's when Patricia turned darker. On a windless night, she crept back toward the fence carrying 2 cans of spray paint. She stood before the massive structure, trembling not from the cold but from adrenaline. Then she painted crude, angry words sprawling across the wood in red and black: eyesore, disgrace, bully. By morning, her work was revealed, but so were the cameras. Unbeknownst to Patricia, Eli's fortress wasn't just built for defense. Every angle, every corner was monitored. When he woke that morning, the footage played back clear as daylight, Patricia, face half hidden beneath her hood, defacing his property. Eli didn't storm over. He didn't confront her. Instead, he did something colder. He called the sheriff. By the afternoon, 2 deputies stood on Patricia's porch. The confrontation was quiet, almost clinical. They showed her the footage, clear and undeniable. Her hands shook as she tried to explain, to justify, to twist the narrative as she always had. But this time, no one listened. They handed her a citation for vandalism and a court summons. The humiliation returned, not digital this time, but physical. Real. Neighbors watched from their windows as the once proud woman stood on her porch, pale and trembling, trying to maintain composure as law enforcement walked back to their cruiser. The internet, of course, found out. Within days, the story reignited online. Karen strikes again and fails harder. New videos emerged, this time mixing footage of her vandalism with dramatic retellings. Memes resurfaced. People laughed. Some pitied her. But Patricia didn't laugh. She didn't sleep. Something in her broke that week. The woman who once thrived on control now found herself cornered by her own actions. Her name became a hashtag. Her home became a spectacle. And her anger, that twisted, festering anger, no longer had an outlet. She began pacing at night, muttering to herself, replaying the same scenes over and over. The letters, the meetings, the wall, the humiliation. Her mind turned inward, and the lines between reason and revenge blurred completely. Meanwhile, Eli stayed the same. Calm. Unmoved. He worked his land as always, tending to his cattle, repairing machinery, keeping his routine simple and steady. But behind that calm exterior, he was not blind to the danger. He had seen what humiliation could do to people. He knew Patricia's type: prideful, cornered, and desperate. So, quietly, he took precautions. Reinforced locks. Security lighting. Extra insurance coverage. And just as he predicted, the retaliation wasn't finished. One frigid February night, a fire broke out along the property line. Flames licked the edge of the fence, racing across the dried winter brush. It spread fast, too fast to be natural. By the time firefighters arrived, a section of the fortress had burned, blackened and cracked but still standing. The investigation ruled it undetermined. But Eli knew. The burn pattern, the accelerant, it all pointed to one person. He didn't need proof to see the truth. And that was when his patience finally shifted. He had built his fence to reclaim peace. Now he would defend it and his name with the same precision he had used to build it. Because some wars aren't fought with words or fire. They're won with endurance and evidence. Eli Turner was done enduring quietly. He was about to end the feud. Once and for all. The fire changed everything. What had once been a neighborhood spectacle turned into a full-scale legal reckoning. The sheriff's department launched an investigation, and although the report stopped short of naming a suspect, everyone in the county knew who it was. Whispers traveled faster than smoke. Patricia Holloway's name sat heavy in every conversation, on the lips of those who pitied her and those who quietly wished she'd finally get what she deserved. For Eli Turner, the damage was more than physical. The charred remains of his fence, blackened and brittle, stood as a reminder that peace had its price. But his resolve didn't break, it hardened. He spent the next week walking the property line, taking photos, documenting the damage, recording every scorch mark, every footprint. He wasn't just rebuilding a wall anymore. He was building a case. Eli had always understood two things: land and law. Both could protect you if you respected them. And this time, he intended to use both as weapons. While Patricia's fire had burned in the night, Eli's plan would burn quietly, through the daylight hours of bureaucracy. He started with the insurance claim, straightforward, factual, and unemotional. He knew it would trigger an inspection, and inspectors always talked. Their reports always found their way to the county office. And once they saw evidence of suspected arson, it would no longer be a feud. It would be a felony. But Eli didn't stop there. He gathered footage from his cameras, printed stills from the night of the fire, and compiled every document, from the first HOA letter to the vandalism citation. He built a timeline, precise and undeniable. It wasn't revenge. It was accountability, measured in legal ink instead of anger. Days turned into weeks, and Patricia's life began to unravel in ways she couldn't control. The county fire marshal requested to speak with her regarding recent events. Her insurance company froze her coverage pending investigation. Her employer, a local real estate office, began distancing themselves from the bad publicity. Patricia had once wielded authority with precision, bending rules and people to her will. Now, every letter that arrived at her door carried the weight of consequence. Inside her house, the walls seemed to close in. Her once pristine rooms were cluttered with unopened mail, legal notices, and the silence of someone who had finally run out of strategies. Meanwhile, Eli rebuilt. Not hastily, not in anger, but methodically, one beam at a time. The new section of the fence was stronger, thicker, and this time, lined with fireproof sheeting beneath the timber. A subtle defiance, a statement written in materials. Neighbors began stopping by, offering help. Some brought tools, others just a kind word. For the first time in months, Eli's farm didn't feel like a fortress against the world, it felt like the heart of a community rediscovering its backbone. Patricia watched from behind her curtains as they worked. Every sound of hammer and saw was torture. Every laugh, every shared word, every sign of solidarity cut deeper than any insult could. And then the official letter arrived. It came from the county prosecutor's office, a notice of intent to investigate a potential act of arson based on submitted evidence. Patricia read it over and over, her hands trembling. It cited video timestamps, insurance reports, and witness statements about a suspicious vehicle seen the night of the fire. That letter marked the first time she felt true fear, not the fear of embarrassment or gossip, but the fear of consequence. She tried to talk her way out. She called the sheriff's office, claiming she was being harassed. She wrote to local news outlets insisting she was innocent. But no one listened anymore. The public had long since chosen their side, and the law was following the same path. Eli never gloated. He never boasted or even acknowledged her directly. But every action he took, every document he filed, pushed the story toward one inevitable truth: actions have cost. Weeks later, investigators arrived to collect samples from the burned section of fence. Patricia stood across her yard, arms folded, pretending not to watch, but unable to look away. The hum of official vehicles, the quiet murmur of voices, it all sounded like a funeral procession for her last shred of control. The evidence was damning: traces of accelerant, boot prints matching her shoe size, fibers from her coat caught in the soot. By spring, Patricia Holloway was charged with destruction of property, trespassing, and attempted arson. The arrest wasn't dramatic: no lights, no handcuffs in front of cameras. Just a quiet knock at her door, a polite reading of rights, and the slow walk to a waiting car. But the story exploded again. The Karen who set fire to her reputation. From HOA queen to convicted arsonist, her name became synonymous with downfall. Online, the same people who had mocked her now dissected her motives like vultures circling a carcass of pride. Eli watched the chaos unfold with quiet detachment. He had never wanted fame, never sought vengeance, only justice. But the world had turned his fence, his simple, stubborn stand, into a symbol of resistance. Reporters came again, but this time, he spoke. Standing beside the newly rebuilt wall, he gave a single statement for the record: "This land's been in my family a long time. I built this fence to protect it, not to fight anyone. But if standing my ground teaches people something about respect, then maybe it was worth the trouble." The quote ran everywhere. The story, once a petty feud, now read like a parable. And as Patricia's trial loomed, Eli turned back to what he had always done best: work. The soil thawed, the cattle returned to pasture, and life settled into rhythm again. Yet beneath that peace, there was something else, a quiet satisfaction that justice had finally found its place. Not through rage or revenge, but through patience, precision, and unshakable resolve. Still, not every story ends neatly. The world would move on to the next viral scandal, but for those who lived it, the scars would remain. Patricia Holloway would soon face the judgment of the court. But in truth, her real punishment had already begun: to wake up every morning and see that wall still standing, stronger than ever, a monument to the limits of control. And Eli Turner, the man she once tried to humiliate, had become the one thing she could never stand against, a symbol of quiet, righteous defiance. The trial was swift. The evidence, overwhelming. Patricia Holloway stood before the court, her once steady voice reduced to a quiver. The woman who had built her life around authority, appearances, and control could now barely hold the gaze of the judge. Her lawyers spoke of stress, of public humiliation, of a mind pushed to breaking point by internet harassment. But the truth was written plainly in the footage, in the soot, in her own defiance captured on camera. The verdict came down like a winter storm, guilty on all counts. Her sentence was lenient compared to what some expected: probation, restitution for damages, mandatory community service. But it wasn't the punishment that mattered. It was the label that followed her now, one she could never wash away. The HOA queen, the self-proclaimed protector of property values, was now a convicted criminal in the same community she once ruled. As Patricia's world shrank to the confines of consequence, Eli Turner's world grew in ways he never intended. The story of the Great Wall of Turner became more than a local legend, it became folklore. Months after the trial, a national documentary team visited the farm. They called it Boundaries, the man who built a wall for peace. They filmed sweeping drone shots of Eli's land, the endless fields, the repaired fence, the scars of the fire still faintly visible in the timber grain. They captured him walking his property at dawn, the sun breaking through the fog, a quiet man framed against the monument of his resolve. Eli agreed to the project reluctantly, but the message resonated far beyond what he imagined. Viewers saw not just a man defending his rights, but a mirror of something deeper, the timeless battle between arrogance and humility, between control and respect. The fence, once a symbol of defiance, became a lesson in boundaries, both physical and moral. Tourists still came, but now they came quietly. They didn't gawk or take selfies. They stood in silence, some leaving small wooden signs at the edge of the road. Hand-carved messages read, "Stand your ground, respect earned, not demanded, justice lives in patience." Eli didn't remove them. He just let them stay, small echoes of a story that had taken on a life of its own. Patricia, meanwhile, sold her house within a year of the trial. The once impeccable property sat unsold for months, its reputation a shadow that no realtor could polish away. When she finally left, it was without ceremony. No moving truck, no goodbyes. Just a car loaded with boxes and a woman who had finally run out of wars to fight. Her departure marked the end of an era, the closing act of a feud that had consumed an entire town. And as the dust settled, life began to move forward again. For Eli, the wall wasn't just a line in the dirt anymore. It was a part of his land, his story, his legacy. He kept improving it, not taller, not grander, just stronger where it needed to be. He planted wildflowers along its base in spring, turning what had once been a boundary of conflict into a living memorial of resilience. As seasons passed, nature softened its edges. Vines began to creep across the timber, birds nested in its corners, and the harshness of its beginnings faded into something almost serene. The fortress had transformed from a weapon into a witness. Sometimes, at dusk, Eli would sit on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun drop behind the wall. He would think of everything that had happened, the letters, the cameras, the fire, and wonder how something so ugly could have given birth to something so enduring. He didn't see himself as a hero. Heroes sought glory. He had only sought peace. But peace, it seemed, came with its own form of justice. And the town learned from it, too. The HOA never reformed. Neighbors spoke to each other more openly, settling disputes face to face instead of through committees and complaints. The old sense of community, once stifled by appearances, began to breathe again. Years later, when people drove past Eli Turner's land, they didn't see a feud, they saw a monument. Parents told their children the story as they passed the fence line, not as gossip, but as a fable. They spoke of a man who stood quietly when others shouted. Who built when others tried to destroy? Who answered arrogance with craftsmanship and cruelty with composure? The world, as it always does, moved on to new scandals, new viral stories, new names to praise or ridicule. But the fence remained. Solid. Silent. Eternal. Eli aged, as farmers do, slowly but steadily, marked by the rhythm of seasons more than by years. And in that rhythm, he found what he had fought for all along: not revenge, not recognition, but rest. When the county eventually held its centennial celebration, they asked him to speak, a rare public request for a man who had built a legacy from silence. He stood before the crowd, gray-haired and sun-worn, and spoke just a few words. A fence doesn't just keep things out. It reminds us what we choose to let in. The crowd fell quiet. And in that stillness, the meaning lingered, not about fences or property lines, but about boundaries of pride, patience, and principle. Long after Eli Turner's time, his land would change hands. The wall would weather, boards replaced, beams strengthened. But the story would stay. People would still come to see it. The fence that started as defiance became justice and ended as peace. And they would remember that somewhere in a quiet corner of the countryside, a farmer once turned a line of cedar and steel into something far greater than a wall. He turned it into a legacy.